Hello, people of 2025. Welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I am Anthony, your host. Attentive listeners of this podcast will know that back in the spring, it hosted a couple of panel discussions focusing on genetic history and ancient DNA and the methodologies and results of that kind of research, which is a kind of new eruption into the field. It was not research that was possible before the previous generation. And I happen to be very interested in this in part because I started out in biology and particularly genetics. This is what I thought I was going to study before I very bizarrely became a Byzantinist in Ohio. Though I never came even remotely close to the kind of laboratory work that is being done now, nor am I qualified to assess its data, but I do need to understand its methodologies and the fundamental underlying concepts, because this is going to be a growing area of research and we need to know how to handle it. In particular, it poses significant challenges to sort of conventional text-based historians such as myself, because it operates with different concepts, different timescales, and it looks at people through a very different prism. This is only to be expected. This happens already. For example, if you look at human history by focusing on language, you're going to have to classify people and talk about trajectories and patterns that are very, very different than if you're talking about, say, states or religions. All of those analytical categories have their own timescales and rhythms, and they look at the world in terms of its physical geography and the people in it very differently. And the same is true about genetics, though here the differences are somewhat larger. And when I say that this poses a challenge to historians such as myself, I mean that in a good way. Like, I want to be challenged. I want to think about different timescales and different aspects of the human experience. And in particular, this type of research challenges me to think differently about timescales and identity. And let me illustrate that with a kind of thought experience that I had when I was studying genetics, back in high school, so I'm a teenager at this time. And the image that I could not get out of my mind was the fact that every single person or organism that is alive today, or at any time it has been alive, is the product of a continuous chain of biological reproduction that is 1 billion years old. Every single one of us, like by definition, without exception, cannot but be the product of such a chain, which is, in my mind, staggering to think about. Now, obviously, there have been a lot of lost chains of transmission. Sort of many people, but other living organisms fail to reproduce to the next generation. And so their lines of transmission are lost or broken in a way. But for every one of us who is here, that is a logical consequence. Now, here's the other incredible thing, is that if you line up all of the ancestors of any particular organism, from generation to generation, they are not going to be that different from each other. But if you swipe left or swipe right, I don't know, fast enough, you're going to start seeing these changes accumulate pretty dramatically until you're looking at a different species. An utterly different species, something that just simply does not fit into our models of history at all, right? Now, to a certain degree, this also happens, let's say, with languages. So in most cases, people can speak to their parents and grandparents, though we all know that there are cases of sort of historical disruption and linguistic change that sometimes make that difficult, but normally that's possible. And I feel confident I could speak to someone who was speaking Greek 1,000 years ago, and possibly 2,000 years ago, with some special training, not that much, but some. But the further back you go, the more languages change to the point where they become incomprehensible to their later speakers and thereby are a different species, a different language that is just incompatible. Again, the time scales are different here, right, from genetics and language. The same if you look at states, for example. Some states last very long, others don't. But all of these models challenge views about human societies, communities, groups, and identity in pretty serious ways. If you take current identity claims made by, say, nations or ethnic groups or about races and so on, if you take them at face value, these timescales challenge those very much. Nothing about the current human ordering of things, whether it be language or religion or state, or the genetic affinities that a certain group might have, the kind of biological thinking that underpins a great deal of nationalist thought, that all becomes very contingent if you think about the time scale broadly enough, right? Very much a circumstance of the way things are right now. But if you go back far enough, and sometimes not very far, they're very, very different. And here's where we have to be extra careful about the way we interpret genetic data, which is now quickly becoming available for people from antiquity, which we'll be talking about in our discussion today, but also because we now are faced with the existence of genetic testing companies that are not studying ancient DNA, they're studying current populations, and you know how it works. You send them some saliva, and they send you a bunch of results about where your ancestors likely came from, and here's one of the rubs, that the way that these companies define the groups that they link you to is very important. Are they linking you to groups by country, right, or by ethnicity, or by race, or by language, or how are they defining their comparison groups? And here's where we start attaching modern identity labels to genetic material, that is, to genetic affinities that have their own histories that transcend those kinds of categories. And so we have to be very careful about how we label a lot of this data. In fact, my understanding of this, actually I read a book in preparation for this recording by a scholar called Kambourakis, and it's called Ancestries Reimagined, Dismantling the Myth of Genetic Ethnicities, where, if I understand it correctly, when these testing companies send you results saying you're X% from, Ireland or whatever, the layperson's response is to think, oh, I have that many ancestors from Ireland. But in fact, these companies are basically labeling a certain statistical distribution of genetic traits as Ireland, when those traits, in fact, exist possibly everywhere in the human population, but their statistical distribution is denser in some places than in others, and so that place gets designated, Ireland or so on. Anyway, I wanted to provide an insider's look at how this type of research is being carried out and some of the problems that it faces, both in itself, but also in interfacing with other types of historical analysis. And so I immediately thought of my guest today, who is Hannah Moots, a researcher at the Center for Paleogenetics in Stockholm. And she was actually a contributor to the panel discussions that we posted back in the spring. And I thought that she was and would be an excellent spokesperson for this kind of research. And the opportunity came along for me when I read an article in Archaeology magazine about another article on the genetic history of Rome. This was carried out by a team of scholars. And so I went and I found that. And that article is called, I have it here, Ancient Rome, A Genetic Crossroads of Europe and the Mediterranean. As happens very often in these kinds of publications, it lists very many authors, 30. And I should just say, I can't name them all here or explain why these papers have so many co-authors. Hannah was extremely gracious toward her co-authors and collaborators on this project. I think she wanted to list them and thank them all individually because they all contribute essential parts to these projects. Now, we can't do that here, but I do encourage you to look at this article. It's not very long, and it mostly consolidates genetic research that has already been carried out. So as I understand it, it's drawing the big picture conclusions from more specialized studies. Anyway, I was right about Hannah. She was a wonderful person to talk to about this, and provided me with some very interesting things to think about as I process this type of new research. Okay, I will leave it there. I've spoken long enough, and let's let Hannah take it from here. Before we get to that, thanks again to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. Here's my conversation with Hannah. Hannah, welcome back to the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's just be clear what we're doing here. You and I think, first met on Zoom in the spring when we recorded those episodes that Tina had organized on paleogenetics and history. And they were very long, and there were a lot of people. And a lot of the audience found them very interesting. And I got lots of email about them, and thousands of people downloaded them. But I also got the sense from their questions, and also just from being present, that they left many things kind of unexplained, and especially for lay people who don't quite understand what ancient DNA research is, like how it works and what exactly it's telling us. And even at the time, I realized that you were one of the most sort of clear and articulate spokeswomen for this field, spokeswomen for this field, but you didn't have enough time there to do it. And so I thought, especially when I came across your article, co-written with another 57 people, on the genetic history of Rome, I thought this would be a great opportunity to put these two things together, right? So,
well, thanks. I mean, it's exciting to have an opportunity to speak about all this. And
yeah. I mean, that was more for the audience that what we're doing. You and I have discussed this. So what we're going to do here is in the framework of this article on the genetic history of ancient Rome, we're also going to talk a little bit about the kind of mechanics of working with ancient DNA, how it's done, and what do the results actually tell us, and what do they not? Because a lot of people are doing like DNA tests for themselves and their families these days, and I'm pretty sure they're not exactly sure what those results are telling them. Right? So we'll talk about that. Okay, so let's start first. Just to set the stage, can you tell us about the sample group that you used to survey the genetic history of the ancient Romans? So how many people's remains are we talking about? Where were they found? And what is their kind of distribution in time?
yeah, absolutely. So for the first paper we worked on this was in 2019. And then we also had two follow-up papers because there were so many unanswered questions from the first one. But this first 2019 one on the population of ancient Rome focused on the city itself. And we screened over 200, you use skeletal material, usually the petrous bone, but we screened over 200 individuals for ancient DNA. We were really lucky to have good preservation in a number of individuals, and we're able to get 127 genomes that we could work with. And so we collaborated with a lot of biological anthropologists and archaeologists from Rome and Lazio to put together a data set from 27 sites. Some of those sites are well known and well researched, like Isola Sacra, which is the main necropolis of Ostia and Portus, which are the two big ports of ancient Rome. And some much less known, one was unnamed, just from an excavation from a transit project. So I even went to that site, but it's just at Crossroads. So yeah, so sort of a range of sites. Yeah.
That bone that you mentioned, so in the preliminary reading that I did in preparation here, it's something behind the ear, right?
Yeah, it's part of the temporal bone, so it's part of the inner ear. And there's been research done by Ron Panassi, and he was one of the co-authors on this project sort of identifying what part of the skeleton has the best DNA preserved. So initially people thought it would have been non-skeletal tissue, and then they realized it'd be bone, and they were targeting things like long bones and ribs, and it actually turns out it's this part of the inner ear. And I think both because it's protected from environmental factors, because it's internal to the skull. Yeah, and also because it's quite dense.
Okay. But that wouldn't be around where that sort of gel is that tells us our sense of balance.
Yeah, it's exactly there. Yeah.
No way.
Yeah, yeah, the cochlea, yeah.
I have a
Yeah.
serious feud with that part of my body.
Oh no. Oh,
Oh yes,
no.
yes. Yes, I just sort of a structural flaw in my design. Because I don't know what happens, but the gel kind of float those little crystals
Mhm.
in the gel. I have this thing where often they'll just be all over the place and I'll be getting mixed signals.
Mhm.
And so,
Oh,
it just feels that the world around me is swimming and all that. So,
I'm sorry. That sounds awful. Yeah.
yeah, and it's kind of unpleasant. Okay. The way I put it is that my crystals are misaligned, which is true, but it comes across in a very, anyway, okay. So how is DNA extracted from that? Like on the technical side, what are you doing?
Yeah, so you essentially take bone, you can either powder it or sort of just cut it into small pieces and then dissolve it. Um, yeah, and actually it's interesting, a lot of the techniques that are now used for ancient DNA are modified from what was used for modern DNA. And so even the extraction is targeted to retain short molecules because DNA has fragmented so much over time. So there's a paper by Jesse Dabney that has this buffer that's different from modern extraction kits that everybody uses now. Yeah, so there's sort of been a lot of optimizations for how to target DNA that might actually have been really fragmented and broken down through time and damaged through time. Uh,
And do you do this technical?
Yeah,
Okay, so all right. So lab work, right? Gloves, glasses, all okay.
yes. Yeah, full suit, full Tyvek suit, so we're not shedding DNA on our samples. Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, of course. Um, and who does the sequencing once you have it?
Yeah, so the sequencing, we usually send the libraries, they're called libraries once you've done the extractions and other preparations. And that usually takes about a week. I describe it as like a week working with clear liquids and hoping that everything goes okay. And that you only sort of find out at the end of that week. But essentially, because the sequencing machines are really expensive, they cost over $1 million, that individual labs don't have them. And sometimes individual institutions don't have them either. So often there's either a university-based, national-based, or private sequencing centers that do the actual sequencing. So you take your samples to them, and then they give you the data because it's just prohibitively expensive to have your own machine.
How much does it cost to hire these labs to sequence like one sample or
Yeah, you can sort of do different. They're called flow cells, and so essentially, the more that you sequence, the cheaper it is per
okay.
read. So ideally, you want to be able to sequence a bunch of these what we call libraries together at the same time, so that it's cheaper for the data that you're getting back. So there's a lot
Okay.
of logistics. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, yeah, no, it's just fascinating for me to learn. And I've been, tr being diligent. I'm trying to read up on all of this stuff, but I still have questions because a lot of the technical literature, it kind of takes for granted things that are obvious to you, but are not to me. And so here's a question that I keep having. So when you sequence DNA from a skeleton, from ancient Rome, and you send it to some company that has a database of, you know, to compare it to. Are those databases of other ancient DNA samples, or are they just the modern ones, like where you send, what is it, 23andMe or whatever those things are? Because anyway, you can understand what implications it would have. So is it the one or the other?
Yeah, no, that's an awesome question. We actually do that in-house too. So we do the analysis. Yeah, so on the Rome project, the 2019 one, that was primarily my colleagues Margaret Antonio and Ziwei Gao. They're the two co-first authors with me on that paper. And I did, as I was mentioning, all the lab work stuff. But since then, I've been learning computational stuff. So on a follow-up 2023 paper, I was doing the computational analysis. But yeah, we have our own yeah, our own teams do that sort of analysis. And then the data sets that we use, there's some similarities and some differences to what might be used at an ancestry testing company. But I think it's a really good example because, as you mentioned, that's how a lot of people are familiar with these concepts, is maybe, what they've heard about ancestry testing companies. And I think a shared challenge between the two is sort of how do we categorize the data, right? Human diversity is so complex. How do we categorize it
Yeah.
and explain it? And so different ancestry companies will handle this different ways. There's some, for instance, that we use geographic countries. There's some that will use computational clusters, and then they'll label those clusters after the fact. So they might not map onto a country at all. They might even map onto past mobility events that have happened. And then some companies actually use like linguistic and cultural groups to like specifically avoid using colonial country boundaries. So there's sort of a lot of choices that go into how we organize this data. And I think that's a sort of shared challenge between genomic research and then ancestry testing companies. Yeah. Yeah, go
The
ahead.
main question is, so when you're comparing this DNA from ancient Rome that you find, you're
Mm-hmm.
comparing it to which groups? Like other ancient DNA?
Yes. Yeah, and as well as modern. And in fact, one story that I really like about sort of one of these challenges in ancient DNA was in 2012, the genome of Ötzi, which was this naturally mummified individual found in the Alps in Italy, was
Yeah.
sequenced by Keller et al. 2012, and there was like no other ancient genomes from anywhere nearby because the first ancient human genomes were sequenced in 2010. So this was just 2 years later, and there weren't any genomes from I think anywhere in Europe at the time. And so they really didn't have other ancient genomes to compare this individual to. And so they only had modern genomes. And they said, oh, this individual is most similar to present day, genetically, most similar to present day individuals from Sardinia. And so they said, well, it could either be that they or their family recently sort of migrated from Sardinia to the Alps, or that there were a number of people, in Italy or in Europe at the time that had ancestry that'd be best approximated by Sardinia today. And it turned out to be that second case, but they had no
Sure.
idea.
Right, because in the past 2,000 years, people have moved around a lot, and
Yeah.
therefore their genes have moved around a lot.
Yeah.
And so if a group or if a particular sort of DNA sequence, and we'll talk a little bit about what that is sort of statistically more prevalent in some part of the world today than you might say Sardinia or you might say whatever, 2,000 years ago, it might have been somewhere else.
Yeah.
So how does one correct for that? Like how do how do you process these two different timescales?
Yeah, I mean, I think one way that's really helpful is what you suggested earlier, is to use ancient genomes and to use contemporaneous ancient genomes. Because
Hmm.
as you said, there's been so much mobility in the past. A lot of people, when they talk about the ancestry of any place today, is admixed from a number of sources further in the past. And so it can be helpful to have sort of contemporaneous samples or contemporaneous individuals to say, who are these individuals similar to at the same time. Yeah, it can be quite challenging though. And one thing that we've noticed is that sort of prior to the Iron Age, there was often, and this is in sort of the European and Mediterranean context, there's often a strong link between geography and genetics. And in the Iron Age, when people start sailing, they start moving around the Mediterranean. It breaks down a lot. And so you're finding the individuals that are most close genetically may be quite far away. So you might be, looking at an individual in Greece, and the most similar individual is in, Tunisia or Italy or Spain. What we think of as those countries today. So,
Right. So I take it that the databases of modern DNA are vastly more sort of robust, larger than the ones of ancient DNA, right? That must
mhm.
be millions and millions and millions. Whereas the ones for ancient DNA, which are probably also sort of distributed not only geographically but in time, are probably growing much slower.
Yeah,
But they are
yeah,
growing, right?
yes,
Okay.
yeah. I
And
think
this is
there's
part of
about
the work that you're doing. Like when you do this, that your results then become like accessible to other scholars working?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, there's a few databases that make all published ancient genomes available for anyone to use, which is great. And then we use those in our research too. So we're both adding to that and using it. And there's one called the Allen Ancient DNA Database that's curated by Swapan Malik in David Reich's lab at Harvard. And then there's another one called Poseidon that's curated by Stephen Schiffels and his team at the Max Planck in Leipzig. And so it's really great to have these. When we were first working on the Rome project, my colleague Margaret was these didn't exist yet. And so we were any paper that would come out that was relevant, we'd download the data and sort of try and make our own internal one. And it was really nice to have a database like this that they're constantly adding to and updating.
Okay.
And there's even, oh, go ahead, sorry.
No.
Yeah, there's even so it comes with, at least the Allen Ancient DNA database has 4 files, 3 of which you would want to access computationally or sort of are more compute heavy to access. And then there's one that essentially can be downloaded and viewed in Excel. So when I teach classes, for instance, my students will look through this and identify individuals or family groups or essentially we in classes I teach, students will do a small genetics project and you can look through these files and see what data is available just with Excel or basic computing skills. So that's really nice.
Yes, I've glimpsed some of these spreadsheets, and
Yeah.
yes, they make my sort of department budget spreadsheets look child's play. I mean, I was lost. Anyway, the spreadsheets will do that to me. This is just kind of an initial my mind just tunes out. But okay. Another thing that has become clear to me is that when we're testing for DNA, let's set the sort of ancient DNA aside for a moment. Like when people test for DNA today, or they have their DNA sequenced and it's compared to other groups from all over the world. Now, the thing is that what you're finding are similarities that are sort of more proximate in time, because the farther back you go, obviously, the more ancestors you have, and so the more complex it gets, and you get less and less from each of your ancestors the farther back you go, right? So that even if you're descended from someone 2,000 years ago and you can identify whatever, but there's probably, I don't think that DNA testing would reveal that, right? Because there's probably so little that's been passed down in common.
Yeah. If you think about it, even just within a few generations, you share 50% of your genome with one of your parents, and then a quarter with one of your grandparents, and less and less, half as you go back each time. And then at some point, you sort of, everybody on Earth is your ancestor, right? The number of ancestors. Yeah.
So, when I first had this thought, it was when I saw the movie of the Da Vinci Code.
Oh, I haven't seen it.
Okay, you know the general plot,
Yeah.
right? Okay. Because the premise is that, spoilers, I guess, this was 30 years ago, that there is a descendant of Mary, I think Jesus, something, I don't know, somewhere in France, obviously, because there's these medieval stories about the Virgin Mary moving to France and all of that. But I left the theater thinking, wait a minute. If you do the math, right? Like I have more theoretical ancestors who were alive at the time of Christ than there were people on the planet.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Which of course can be explained because we're not always talking about discrete ancestors with every generation.
Exactly.
Right. And I also got to thinking, like, when people, like, a historical question is like, are the modern Greeks descended from the ancient Greeks? And I realized, well, yes, of course they are, and so is everyone else. But I don't know what that does to like national narratives or anything, but it clearly, okay, so there might be more concentration of descent in one area than another. Fine. But we're really testing for proximate ancestry. Is that right? So when you send in like your kid and they tell you, oh, like 30% Irish or whatever, that's what that means. It's like very recent historically, not back 1,000 years.
Yeah. Often these companies have, and I think their databases are actually made up of their own customers, right? So their databases are proprietary and not public. So they're sort of saying, oh, your genome or part of your genome is most similar to, these other genomes that we have in the database, which is part of what explains why, people can get different results from different companies that might even use similar categories is it's just based on yeah, those databases. So yeah.
Yeah. So this is something that I became sort of sensitized to when I read this book by Kaburakis, Ancestry
Mhm.
Reimagined, which tried to explain all of this. So, and correct me if I may not have understood this right, but and my terminology is probably not going to be correct and technically. But when we say testing DNA and you match it up to like, I don't know, Ireland, I think is an example he uses or something like that. What we're talking about is so there's not some sort of sequence of genes or allelomorphs or whatever that are distinctive to Ireland.
Mhm.
It's some sort of statistical distribution of variants. And there might be like 60-40 in Ireland, there might be 40-60 in Scotland, and you're like kind of, well, that's kind of more in that area. That's what you're being told, right?
Yeah, and I only hesitate a little because also many of the algorithms that these companies use are proprietary. So one could say, I think they're using allele frequencies, right, which is what you're talking about, but I don't know for sure.
Okay.
But yeah, I think that that's what a lot of this is based on is sort of the frequencies of different alleles. They can range from there's even a word for when just one person has an allele, which is an allele is when you have yeah, it's just different base pairs at the same place in the genome. So if one person has a G, somebody else has a T, but there's singleton for when just one person who's ever been sequenced has that. And so that might mean that it's a new de novo mutation. We all
Hmm.
have between 40 and 80 of those that we didn't inherit from our parents, but are mutations that happened in our gestational
Okay.
history, right? Yeah. And
Right.
yeah, so you
So
could
I
have
might
one.
have the allele for sort of translating Greek text for 16 hours a day. Like that's what I got.
Genetic. No.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, there's also, in addition to allele frequencies, there's also things like sharing whole segments of your genome. That's called identity by descent. And that's also how you can see ancestors. And that's work that's been done by Harold Ringbauer. And that's cool to see because you can actually identify more distant relatives
Okay.
that way, which is interesting that you could find somebody's eighth cousin or something like that. Yeah, so it's like when you're sharing an identical segment. Yeah, as somebody else that maybe you've inherited from a common ancestor. And
Right,
so
right. As if the modern society doesn't have enough obstacles to dating, but now we need to know who our eighth cousin is. Okay. All right. Um, great. Okay, because this was actually a bit of a revelation to me that the results are some kind of algorithm that's leaning on a sort of statistical distribution model, and not though I think most people really do think of it as like, oh, there are distinctive
Hmm.
genes that match on to being
Oh,
French.
yeah, yeah.
It's not. It's like a worldwide distribution of variants, and there's a cloud, and you're kind of the algorithm is just kind of gesturing towards some part of that cloud.
Yeah, and that we're all so similar. I mean, we're all 99 point something something
Yeah.
something percent similar, right? And that, if one is either reading a paper and seeing different groups or clusters described or looking at ancestor results, that's sort of when people have zoomed in on any differences that exist, and that if you were to contextualize humans in a bigger picture, yeah, we're all incredibly similar. All of our genomes are mostly identical. Yeah.
Right. But for some reason, these exercises are focusing on differences.
Mhm.
And I guess that's how we sort of make sense of history. And anyway, all right. Um, I will make a note here to explain what alleles are in the intro. I'm
Yeah,
gonna get
yeah.
I'm gonna get that totally wrong. Okay.
No, no.
Um, so let's talk to you about your Roman samples now.
Mhm.
So tell us again the periods or phases of ancient Roman history that they represent.
Yeah, so for this first paper, we took a very, very longue durée perspective. So the individuals in that study covered about 10,000 years. So we started with the Neolithic. So of course, this is not just Roman history, but a majority of the individuals were from the period around the Roman Empire. But yeah, we started with the Neolithic, looking at transitions through time. We started with the Mesolithic, so we were able to look at the Neolithic transition in Italy and see incoming ancestry that could be modeled by Anatolian Neolithic. So even 10,000 years ago, we're seeing this admixture between local hunter-gatherers and individuals with ancestry from Anatolia. And then, yeah, through time, mostly concentrated on the Iron Age, Roman period, late antiquity, and the medieval period. Yeah, to sort of look at who was in Rome and central Italy at this time.
Right. So tell us the big picture results that you obtained. So what did these samples tell you about the genetic history of the Romans from, say, like the period of imperial expansion in during the Republic, the early empire, and then the later empire? Let's look at those three periods.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things we saw that was really surprising to us about the Iron Age and the early Republican period was how heterogeneous Central Italy already was. That we saw a lot of diversity preceding Roman imperial expansion. So Central Italy was already part of these big long distance trade works. We already knew that from material culture that had been found in Central Italy that was originating from other parts of the Mediterranean. But it was really interesting to see individuals from other parts, or at least that had ancestry from other parts of the Mediterranean, as well as other parts of Europe, like Central Europe. Yeah, in places like Tarquinia. So one of the sites that we studied in this 2023 paper, because we felt like the Iron Age was sort of a period that was, yeah, we wanted to explore more. Yeah, we found individuals. We found about was it about 60% continuity with preceding populations, but about 40% of individuals had ancestry that could be best modeled by elsewhere in the Mediterranean or Europe, including North Africa, including the Levant, including Central Europe. So it was interesting to see, including individuals buried together. We were lucky enough to study some individuals from the same tombs and that they had this
Hmm.
different ancestries while being co-buried. So it's interesting to see.
Now, this is an important point to make here. This is not where those individuals came from.
Right. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
But what?
Where their ancestry came from. So generations, one doesn't know how many, but yeah, generations back.
You
So,
don't know how many generations.
yeah.
Okay, so the point I made earlier about how these affinities decline over time,
Mhm.
isn't there some sort of horizon of like how many generations would pass before you can, after which you can't meaningfully make connections to their ancestors in Anatolia or whatever? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would depend. Yeah, that's a good point that if you had like maybe we could take a slightly earlier period as an example of this because by this period people are moving around so frequently that they could easily pick partners from who have similar ancestries to them, even if it's not the local ancestry, if that makes sense. But in earlier
Yeah.
periods, there's sort of less movement, there's less mobility. I mean, pre-sailing in the Mediterranean, and so yeah. But I mean, that's right. That if you had sort of uh, one ancestor from somewhere else. Let's take Sardinia. If you had one ancestor from North Africa or from France or from somewhere, and then they sort of uh, had children several generations later, that would be, one 1/8 of your genome or 1/16 or something like that. But by the time, by the Iron Age or by the Roman period, you have many people settling in Italy from elsewhere
Right.
or whose ancestors did. Yeah.
Exactly. So it also depends. It's not just the time distance between this kind of migration, but also
Mhm.
how many people moved and were they able to, like, did they intermarry for generations, thereby preserving the kind of genetic link to whatever group they broke off from. Right.
Yeah, and there could have been, language barriers or things like that. I mean, there could have been lots of reasons that that would happen, and also lots of reasons that it wouldn't. I mean, we definitely see there's been some really interesting work by Mark Haber looking at, this is a little bit later, looking at what is it, the Crusader states in the Levant and looking at admixture between individuals from Europe and from the Levant in those places. So, I mean, there's
Right.
lots of interaction between people in all of these places. So.
Yeah. So what major changes did you find in this kind of distant ancestry of the samples that you studied? Like in terms of Roman history, what are the big patterns that change?
Yeah, I mean, so we talked about sort of this pre-imperial period being very diverse, and then the imperial period is even more diverse. So you have individuals from all over the Mediterranean, so Iberia, North Africa, the Levant, um, and there's a lot from the Eastern, a lot of individuals with ancestry from the Eastern Mediterranean. That was one thing that was striking to us, was sort of the extent of that. Um, yeah, so it's interesting to see. And at Isla Sacra, for instance, we were lucky enough to study some individuals where there had previously been isotopic analysis looking at mobility. So whether they had grown up in central Italy or whether they had grown up elsewhere. This was work by Tracy Prowse and Luca Bondioli and Alessandra Sperduti and others. And we worked with Luca and Alessandra on this, on the Rome paper and the Iron Age paper as well. But we saw that individuals who grew up in central Italy also had very diverse ancestry. So ancestry from the Eastern Mediterranean or from Iberia, for instance. So it was interesting that there's sort of multi-generational families settling in central Italy, we think.
Right. So just so that the audience can follow that. So the isotopic analysis, this is something that my understanding is done on teeth,
Yes.
and it tells you where that individual grew up
Yeah.
or spent formative years of childhood. So that's
Mhm.
about the individual, not about the ancestry.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's aware, it's not ancestry at all. Like your ancestry could be wherever if you just happen to grow up in a certain place. Right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Right, that they're totally unlinked. And we found they were unlinked too when we looked at
Right.
it, which was interesting. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, obviously, in the imperial period, not Rome is not only a center, people emigrate to it. It reaches a huge population. The population of Italy must have soared, but
Hmm.
the Romans brought in slaves from everywhere.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, just in one instance, I remember one of the Aetolian wars, I think they brought in 150,000 slaves from Greece, and after one war, just distributed them around Italy. I mean, that'll do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
Um,
know a lot of people, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, yeah.
I was going to say many inscriptions at Isola Sacra indicate that people were descended from slaves. So they mention
Yeah.
that in their tombstone. So that is,
Yeah.
yeah, that's great to remember that that is a potential source of this ancestry, that people were moving for lots of reasons, for military reasons. You know, there was forced mobility. People were moving for political reasons, even for tourism, right? So that people are moving for all the reasons that people move around today.
Right. And then what happens in late antiquity?
Yeah, in late antiquity, we see it's sort of a bimodal distribution of ancestries. When you're looking at analysis like principal component analysis, you're seeing some uh, ancestries that are continuous with the imperial period, but then you're also seeing more individuals that are similar to Central Europe, for instance. And so this is a time period when you have the Lombards coming in and things like that. But so we're seeing more
Mhm.
ancestries signaling more of a connection between Rome and other parts of continental Europe.
And the Eastern Mediterranean links fall off, right?
Yeah, and one thing I would be so curious about, and we don't know yet, is I'm hoping that folks are working on uh, Constantinople. I would be so curious to see, are some of the trade routes, are some of the, when the capital moves to Byzantium, like are people yeah, I would be really curious if the networks, and the ways that people are moving had been moving to Rome get shifted to Byzantium. I don't know, but that would be cool to see. That's
Oh,
my theory, but I don't know.
yes. A lot
Yeah.
did shift. But I think that the creation of a center of power, such as Constantinople in the East, it attracted sort of all of the elites. It drew on all of them from the Eastern Mediterranean, and they went there as opposed to Rome. So
Mm-hmm.
there would definitely have been a drop off in reasons to go to Rome from the
Hmm.
Eastern Mediterranean. To say nothing of the grain trade and everything else that was rediverted to Constantinople. An interesting, I think it would work in the reverse too. Now, I, I don't know that we have any graves like skeletal, like any kind of skeletal remains from Constantinople in this period. I don't know if that even exists, but I think you would find far fewer Westerners after a certain point.
Mm-hmm.
The last high official in the state of Western origin, it was around 395.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, it was specifically in 395. It was, and he didn't end well. This guy Rufinus, and after that, I mean, other than Justinian brought in a couple people and all of that, but it's that's kind of where that
Mm-hmm.
exchange kind of ends. But the East is still sending people west. I mean, armies and emperors and things like that, but probably not a large scale that would, impact the kind of genetic profile of a population. I don't think so. Yeah.
And the grain trade you were mentioning, that would mostly be like from Egypt, for instance, right? Or
Yeah.
North Africa. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Now, to be sure, neither Rome nor Constantinople wanted the Egyptian sailors to stay for too long after they had
Right.
unloaded the. I mean, they did stay for a while and get drunk and get into brawls, and well, who knows? I mean, maybe they slept around and that would but generally they just wanted to send them off as quickly as possible. You
Mhm.
know, want too many Egyptians.
Well,
Anyway,
that's good to remember too, right? That people are passing through these places, but then not buried there, right? So that might be whole, yeah, segments of the society that are coming to, Ostia and Portus, but then
yeah.
not for long periods of time. Yeah.
So here's another question that I'm always wrestling with, and it resonates with some of the things that we've already discussed. But given that human populations are, in the long view of things, always on the move, right? And in flux. And if you're looking at thousands of years, right? So there's really no sense in identifying any particular type of genetic profile with a place. It's only at that place at a certain time,
Mhm.
right? And because again, I'm coming back to the question of the time scales involved. So when we say that you see ancestry in Italy that indicates, I don't know, Sardinia or Anatolia or whatever, even so, how should I put this? The original pool of that kind of DNA in Anatolia was in Anatolia for a particular historical window. Like there was presumably, if
Mhm.
you go far back enough, it won't have been. Is there any way to assess the size of that historical window? Like we're talking about like Anatolian ancestry from the period X, Y, or what?
Yeah, I mean Neolithic actually. So when it's interesting, there's when you do modeling like this, there's different tools you can use. There's admix tools, there's admixture, which they're two different tools. Yeah, and they both tell you these sort of similar ancestry proportions. And for admixture, for instance, you can either have it be unsupervised, which means you're not giving it source populations, or supervised, where it means you're giving it source populations. And so when people say, oh, terms that you'll see a lot in papers and that we use as well are things like Western hunter-gatherers, and that means like Western Eurasian hunter-gatherers or Anatolian Neolithic. That's sort of both a time, as you were saying, it's both a
Okay.
geographic designation and time
Yeah.
period designation. So for a lot of these, you're taking sort of the Mesolithic, Neolithic populations and sort of freezing that window in time, and then using those ancestries to be informative of later populations. So,
Okay. So there
but
are
you do,
internal kind of baselines that are built into this kind of research so that so you know both when you're talking about, not just where.
yeah, that it's really good to be communicative, right? Because you were saying that ancestry changes a lot, right? And that, uh,
Mm.
Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, there's a small proportion of that. So individuals in Europe today have a small proportion of that, right? But, 15,000 years ago, that would have been, how we would model somebody, in that region. So yeah, it's totally different. So yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, there are not many conversations where you can throw in the expression, but 15,000 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Or
I mean,
there's been these, oh yeah, go
that
ahead.
is a philosophical perspective.
Yeah. There's been these exciting papers recently too about Neanderthal ancestry. So that's sort
Mm.
of aside, an even deeper time perspective. But you make a good point that like, the time period that you're talking about makes a huge difference in how you would model yeah, any given individual's genome. Yeah.
I remember the Neanderthal. So the book that you recommended that I read by
Mhm.
Saini,
Angela Sani. Yeah. She
Sani,
does
yes,
really,
yes.
yeah.
Um, where she talks about the whole Neanderthal, like, do you want to say, it
Wait,
was
no,
a very striking point,
mhm.
how
You think about,
Neanderthals were
wait,
rehabilitated.
Oh, that's a great point, right? That initially people thought they were, when we didn't think they had contributed to present day human genomes, they were sort of depicted. I mean, it's people should go and look up the depictions of Neanderthals from like 1910 because they
Mm.
look, they're based on the great apes. They're certainly not based as looking like us, and
Mhm.
then, now today Neanderthals have, people will even be, they find it very interesting, the fact that people today have Neanderthal and then also Neanderthals sort of cousin is not the right word, but the Denisovans, people also have
Mm.
Denisovan ancestry today, which is yeah, another ancient hominid that's primarily known actually from ancient DNA. So yeah, it's sort of, I don't
Yeah.
even think there's a complete cranium, for instance, found from one of these Denisovan individuals, but we know from their genome that they exist.
Yeah. And the Neanderthals were conveniently rehabilitated once it became apparent that their DNA is most prevalent in like European populations.
European, well, it's interesting because in fact, I think I'll have to double check this, but I think East Asian populations have slightly more than European, but there's been
Oh,
this, as you were suggesting, this like, I don't even know the right word, this fixation on this ancestry source by some individuals, by it's become like I don't even know how to say it, but there are people who take like it's become relevant to certain communities of saying, oh, we have this ancestry and it's a point of pride. And I think, one thing that they're maybe overlooking is that sort of all populations today have ancestry in one way or another from archaic populations. So I think,
yeah.
the point that she's making is that there's people in Europe who want to say, oh, this makes us different, or, they also will make claims like, oh, lactose tolerance makes us different. And they're
I
overlooking
see.
that,
Okay.
yeah,
Okay, yes, yes,
yeah.
you're right. Yeah, yeah. No, I had picked up on the how the Neanderthals were rehabilitated. Oh no, they were really smart and caring and whatever, whatever. As soon as like, oh, now
Yeah,
we have a
yeah.
stake in that.
Right. They make art, they're clever. I
Yes,
mean,
yes.
sure, right, but right that it took proximity to to people to make people look into that. It's interesting. Yeah, and then the political relevance of it too is interesting as well. So, yeah.
Well, let's talk about that. So just generally about this kind of research, because in a certain sense, by the way, so the way I look at history, um, all of this is sort of very interesting, but it doesn't shape how I would ever write like political or cultural history. And like all of these people we're talking about, they didn't know. I mean, presumably they didn't know like what their ancestry, where it was like genetic ancestry was from or anything like that. If they were e- sort of equal members of a culture, they understood each other based on that. And so the ancestry is, whatever. And I understand there's some areas when you're talking about like medical history of populations where it might actually make a difference, but yeah, I don't do that. So anyway, so I find all of this very interesting, but in a certain sense, I don't want it to I don't want it to write history based on this,
Mm-hmm.
in a certain kind of way. But the narratives that your research is producing can, rub up against, political narratives that exist or ideologies, whatever, in ways that they might not find, well, in ways that might either reinforce them or ways that they might find unwelcome. Is this something that, how do you deal with that? Or have you had any interactions that can sharpen those issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's been really enlightening for me is talking with students who are coming from all different disciplinary backgrounds, and sort of asking them like, what do you think of ancient Rome? Like, who was in ancient Rome? And a lot of people's perceptions are shaped by TV and movies, so the depictions that we see from those, they can also be uh, and this may be, because the places that I've worked and taught are in the US, this may be unique to the US and not to other places, but I think they often don't anticipate Rome being as diverse as it was. I think there's an
Hmm.
underestimation of that in the general public. And so, in fact, when we cover this paper in the course, I always will assign a few other, not quite readings, but I'll assign a podcast that has Sarah Darabo, and it was hosted by, I'm trying to remember, Jonathan Van Ness. And so, anyways, it's about the diversity in the ancient Mediterranean. Anyways, I think that's fascinating when they're talking about sort of, linguistic diversity,
Hmm.
yeah, all sorts of different diverse material culture diversity, even different perceptions of sex and gender in those time periods. And then I also have them watch a clip from Samantha Bee, where she interviews, or where she has two comedians, the Lucas brothers, go and talk to some experts at the Met about misconceptions about ancient statues, that essentially, because ancient statues are made of marble, they're perceived of as white, when in fact they would have been painted and represented in many different colors. And so that there can be these misconceptions of Rome and Greece that are maybe perpetuated for certain political agendas that I think somehow end up permeating society at large, or at least like in the US and in the places that I've worked. And so it's uh, Yeah, I don't know. I hope that makes sense that there's this
It,
misconception that I think is common.
it
Yeah.
does, but I'm surprised to hear that there's a misconception about Rome in this way. I'm actually teaching a Roman Civ course in the winter, and I haven't done that in a long time, like ancient Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I will find some way of, you know, probing these kinds of issues because the Roman narrative and the Greek narrative, because you mentioned Greece and Rome, they're very different. The Athenian one, at any rate. So the Roman and the Athenian one. I mean, the Roman story is from the very beginning, like Livy, book one. It's a bunch of people from Asia Minor who go to
Yeah.
Italy, like, you
Yes.
know,
Yeah.
yeah. And then when they create Rome, it was Emma Dench who called it Romulus's asylum, where it's like, yeah, come all, yeah, we'll
Yeah.
intermarry and you just mix groups and then you conquer and slaves come in. It's like the Romans don't have this sense of
Mm-hmm.
like we are a lineage.
Yeah.
It's just not the story. And it enables the Romans to do what they did, whereas the Athenians are
Hmm.
like autochthonous, like that's the right. Like in their mind, they have no relation to other people.
Mm.
They intermarry, like by law, to be a citizen under Pericles and whatever. And so I think that's strange. So I would expect your research to land more like with a shrug when it comes to the Roman Empire, because yeah, but if you were to do the same with Athens, I think you might find much more. I remember in Greece when I was growing up, there were definitely strains of, I'm not saying they're dominant or even very prominent, but there were people who would like denying Indo-European linguistic theory
Mhm.
on the grounds that Greek is an original language, and if other languages resemble it to any degree, it's because they borrowed from it. And like we're happy to let other people borrow from, but don't give me any of this Greeks came to Greece from outside kind of story. Because that's a different narrative. And your kind of research, has the potential to upend that much more than it would in Rome. I would think, but okay, so students just think that about Rome too. All right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's these narratives that sort of originate with the alt-right, but then permeate into the culture more, yeah, that's sort of where they're coming from, but then they do tend to.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes we might be looking at it backwards. In other words, it's not like there is a narrative and and this kind of research calls it into question, but rather it's just simply an aversion to having uh, people from Africa and Asia around. And so then you reverse engineer a narrative, even about Rome, which contradicts Rome's own narratives,
Mhm.
in
Yeah,
order to, keep those people sort of out historically, right? I think it's more like something like that.
that makes sense. Yeah, that it's.
Yeah. All right. Well, the
But
Romans.
sometimes they're powerful, those narrative, right? Even if they're not, there was an example, I think it was like 2017 or something of a comic it might have been made by the BBC, but in the UK, and it had sort of a diverse representation of Romans in Britain, which we know of from epigraphs, we know of from genetics. There was a cool paper by Martiniano et al. Showing an individual with ancestry from either the Levant or Egypt. But somehow people were real upset about this comic, from
Hmm.
this children's comic depicting diverse people. And so I think, you know, yeah, hopefully that the message from these papers, I don't know, hopefully people are taking into account both, the existing evidence from material culture and then also these new
Oh.
genetic approaches as well. Yeah.
Well, we'll see how modern societies adapt to this kind of knowledge. The first time I ever read about this sort of thing was in the case of Iceland.
Hmm.
Because there was a while I was reading a lot about Iceland, and I went there and all. Anyway, and apparently, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, or I'm probably getting this wrong, but like Iceland, a long time ago, decades ago, made this decision to sort of sell the rights to its DNA to some sort of company to, do this kind of research, like way, way, way back when this whole field was sort of getting started. And they, because not a large population at the time was what, 280,000 or something like that. And they discovered a very strong, quote, sort of Celtic, like it's not just Scandinavian,
Hmm.
right? there's all, from Ireland or Scotland or whatever. And this
Mhm.
caused considerable anxiety
Oh,
in Iceland.
oh.
And from a certain distance, it's almost comical that you're like, oh, you're worried you might have some Celtic DNA there. But they very quickly turned it around. It's like, yeah, the Vikings were snatching brides from Scotland or
Oh.
something. And that
Hmm.
explains it. Because yeah,
Yeah.
you had to keep the the gender domination it made the
Mm.
narrative okay.
Oh,
It was strange. And I think now they've maybe come to terms with.
that happened. A similar thing happened with our this Rome paper that like a
No.
popular blogger then took it and made a similar claim and said, "Oh, this diversity must be from slavery," and it was like, "Oh boy." So,
Uh,
yes, I mean, yeah, yeah. And of course that's probably part of the story, but I think that
yeah.
the claim they were making, right, is that they could sort of right, exempt the Roman elite from this diversity that we're seeing, which of course would not be the case. So I think
Uh,
that's what they were trying to do.
yeah, but not even on the grounds of slavery can you exempt the Roman elite. Because
That's a good point.
a lot of them were, anyway. Okay. Yeah, it's interesting, interesting. Obviously, the modern narratives are the ones that are more sort of vulnerable or have, anxiety attaches to them. But it's interesting that the ancient ones also produced this. I mean,
Mhm.
do you have like a kind of theory as to what you're doing, like the impact of your work, like on a certain level, you're just doing the science. And we need to respect the results of the science and work on the science and improve it and so forth. And, everybody else has to adjust to it. I get it. Um, but are there areas of historical knowledge that, um, like, what are you contributing to the history in a very big picture? I know this is a very general question, but like, what are you adding?
No, it's a great question. And it actually makes me think of like how I got into the discipline. So when I went to college, I went to University of Chicago actually as an undergrad.
Right.
And I was interested in majoring in chemistry, loved science. And then I took a class from Michael Dietler called Ancient Celtic Societies. And he talked a lot about the political salience of this past to people today, which I thought was fascinating. And then I also was lucky enough to work with Paul Serino, who does both paleontology and some archaeology and is really engaged in community engagement. He has lots of programs with schools. So I was lucky enough to be like the TA on like a Chicago public school teachers outing to do field work in Wyoming, which was incredible. Yeah, but seeing both sort of the political salience of the past to today, as well as sort of the ways that people get excited about the past. These teachers that we worked with, and a lot of us are still in touch actually, and this was a long time ago. Have used that experience to make modules for their class. And I think yeah, I don't know.
Right.
So I think, yeah, both the ways that, yeah, this work is relevant to politics today, and then also, yeah, exciting for students and yeah.
So if I can add to that, I mean, and that's wonderful work, but the way I think about it, just for myself, perhaps, is that it. So I mentioned earlier, it's kind of a philosophical perspective, and I do think that. In other words, the time scales on which you work, I think they show how temporary and sort of transient the little clusterings of humanity that we call whatever ethnic groups or nations are, they come and go. If you take a broad enough perspective, and I think all people should take a broad enough perspective, these things are very trivial.
Yeah.
And you're having these sort of culture wars over things that if you just zoom out a little bit, just a little bit, you mentioned Neolithic earlier, you're just in such a different world that all of it becomes irrelevant because none of this existed. Right? There were no Italians, there were no Athenians. Right? Well, actually,
Yeah.
maybe there were Athenians because you haven't gotten there yet. But Diogenes Laertius says that I don't know, the Greeks or the Athenians have been at it for like 50,000 years. He says 50,000 years. I have seen
Conspiracy theory turn.
yes,
No.
no, I have seen Greek politicians who cite that number from Diogenes, 50,000 years.
Well,
Yes.
and I think, yeah, continuity can be, genetics, like you were saying, it's just like one small piece of any identity or any puzzle, so
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. Excellent, Hannah. Thank you so much for
Oh,
your
thank you
work
so
and
much.
for coming
Likewise.
onto the podcast. This was fun.
Thanks so much for doing this. And yeah, I really appreciate it.
All right. Take care.